And now, Kappo and The Rev present a KaTR classic, Anne of Green Gables. I would have thought that Pringle family would have silenced us before we had a chance to get to Chapter 5, Anne's History.
As Anne, Shirley, and Marilla Cuthbert set out upon their journey, the most harrowing stop was directly at the end of the drive at Green Gables. Rachel Lynde was sitting on her porch with her daily washbin full of clothes and underclothes. As she took her first look upon Anne and Marilla together, her mouth gaped as wide as her... Thomas! Are you seeing this?
Rachel yelped, her voice echoing up the brook all the way to Matthew Cuthbert, who was working the east field with Jerry Boot. Yes, Rachel.
Thomas stated the facts that his limited masculine capabilities could muster.
Miss Cuthbert, driving the mare with a young girl, looks to be traveling.
Traveling? Girl!
Rachel said with her eyes narrowing, bringing the figures of the horse and the buggy into tighter focus. Rachel had to rely on the eyes of her passive husband these days, as her own vision had degraded significantly in recent years.
Good morning, Marilla!
Rachel bellowed from the porch.
Marilla's head not only bowed, it dove like a gull after a whitefish as they passed by Rachel Lynde. Marilla had heard every word of the Lynde investigation into their appearance, motives, and destinations, but ignored it in favor of a long, deep head bow that could take the place of any and all interactions. On Prince Edward Island, the nod while driving was so deeply ingrained that only anxious rogues like Matthew Cuthbert could get away without it. But it could also be used to excuse oneself from polite conversation as one whizzed by an annoying busybody. Thomas, you must be losing your eyes as well. Marilla personally assured me that she was getting a boy.
Rachel scolded her husband, rolling her eyes.
Perhaps you should wear your spectacles out of doors these days as well, instead of just in the parlor.
Rachel, dear, if there was a boy in that buggy, I'll wear my spectacles to bed from now on.
Thomas chortled, amusing himself a little too much for Rachel's liking. Thomas, if I find that my Marilla Cuthbert is housing an orphan girl, I'll bring that cucumber of yours to bed.
Rachel said slyly, and Thomas choked on his morning biscuit.
Matthew Cuthbert was carrying 3 bushels of cucumbers up the avenue along the creek and heard every word coming from the crossroads. He hummed quietly to himself in an attempt to escape being privy to the Lynde's marital repertoire.
Rachel, don't say something you'll regret, girl.
Thomas cooed with a boyish smile.
Don't till the soil if you don't want to plant your cucumbers.
Thomas!
Rachel shouted as the horse and buggy finally left the earshot of the traveling Cuthbert and her unwanted red-haired orphan. Girl. Dear and merciful Lord,
Marilla muttered to herself.
I'm the one who should move away from here.
What was that, Ms. Cuthbert?
Anne asked with eyes that seemed more dreary and hopeless with each clomp of the old mare's hoof. I said, tell me about yourself, child. Surely you must know something of yourself.
What I imagine about myself might be far more interesting,
Anne replied. She had told her origin story to far too many people in her short life, and embellishment was the only way around the drudgery. But there was something different about Marilla, so Anne did the best she could to recall her origins.
Anne watched as a patch of wildflowers danced out of the way of the buggy's wheel and just escaped her grasp, and she sighed, My life has become a perfect graveyard of buried hopes.
Anne whipped her head backwards and watched the wildflowers disappear behind them, forever.
I read that in a book once, and sometimes say it to myself in times of trial. It was then as the tandem took the next sharp turn over a bluff that gave way to the full view of Avonlea. As the two silently enjoyed the breathtaking beauty of the moment, Marilla had time to think of the perfect response to Anne's morose comment. When Angus Iverson shouted from the roadside up ahead,
Hey, how do, Marilla? Fancy you two give me a ride to White Sands?
Angus asked with a rosy smile, his hard and disheveled look of yesterday giving way to smart, clean clothes, a look 10 times as handsome as he'd been the day before.
Mr. Iverson,
Marilla stated plainly, employing the same tactic as earlier with Rachel Lynde, bowing her head and giving the sorrel mare a whip that made the right corner of her mouth curl up anxiously. Who is that man?
asked Anne as she peered back at Angus with a smile and wave. Angus Iverson is one of Matthew's queer old friends.
Marilla gave way to Anne's question.
He comes around from time to time. Word was years ago that he sought to be my beau, but I'd seen far too much tomfoolery from the fellow to ever consider him proper marriage material.
Oh my, he is quite the odd fellow. Why, yesterday while I was sitting at the station, I took witness to Mr. Iverson as he...
Anne began the frightfully truthful tale of the exploits of Angus Iverson, but Marilla interjected. Mind your tongue how you speak of an elder.
Marilla charged.
You have no business in the affairs of any resident in this town, and I expect that wherever you travel from here, you will not speak of anyone from Avonlea nor Green Gables.
Marilla's mind went nearly mad with the thought of what the unhinged tongue of Anne Shirley would wag along her future travels. Heaven knows the carpetbaggers and hobos who would hear tell of a place called Green Gables, tucked away on Prince Edward Island. Yes, Miss Cuthbert,
Anne said. Despite being a child prone to speaking too much, Anne rarely if ever engaged in gossip of any kind. Being brought up institutionally, one quickly requires the ability to look the other way and keep their mouths shut when the situation called for it. You know far too much of us already, and I know hardly anything of you, girl. Again, tell me about yourself. Anne took a deep breath and seemed to search herself for an answer. She then peered over the sunlight dancing atop Barry's pond and said,
I've made up my mind to enjoy this drive. It's been my experience that you can nearly always enjoy things if you make up your mind firmly that you will. Of course, you must make it up firmly. I am not going to think about going back to the asylum while we're having our drive. I'm just going to think about the drive.
Think about forming some sort of explanation for yourself, child,
Marilla said incredulously.
Have you any idea as to where you come from?
Oh, what I know about myself isn't really worth telling,
said Anne eagerly.
If you'll only let me tell you what I imagine about myself, you'll think it ever so much more interesting. Marilla began to dread this 5-mile ride as much as Anne was attempting to enjoy it. She couldn't stand people who refused to get to the point of a matter.
No, I do not want any of your imaginings. Just stick to the bald facts. Begin at the beginning. Where were you born and how old are you?
I was 11 last March,
said Anne, resigning herself to bald facts with a little sigh.
I was born in Bolingbroke, Nova Scotia. My father's name was Walter Shirley, and he was a teacher in the Bolingbroke High School. My mother's name was Bertha Shirley. Aren't Walter and Bertha lovely names? I'm so glad my parents had nice names. It would be a real disgrace to have a father named, well, say, Jebediah, wouldn't it?
It doesn't matter what a person's name is, as long as he behaves himself,
said Marilla, attempting to impart some sort of moral with a long, hard stare. Well, I don't know.
Anne looked away thoughtfully.
I read in a book once that a rose by any other name would smell as sweet, but I've never been able to believe it. I don't believe a rose would be as nice if it was called a thistle or a skunk cabbage.
It would smell and look exactly as it does today,
Marilla stated.
The meaning and context of the word would simply change and you'd never notice.
I suppose my father could have been a good man even if he had been called Jebediah, but I'm sure it would have been a cross. Well, my mother was a teacher in the high school too, but when she married father, she gave up teaching, of course. A husband was enough responsibility.
Anne smiled.
Marilla frowned and said with a huff,
Responsibility indeed.
Oh, it sounds wonderful to me.
Anne doubled down on her crooked, cherubic smile.
They went to live in a weeny-teeny little yellow house in Bolingbroke. I've never seen that house, but I've imagined it 1,000 times. I think it must have had honeysuckle over the parlor windows and lilacs in the front yard and lilies of the valley just inside the gate. Yes, and muslin curtains in all the windows. Muslin curtains give a house such an air. I was born in that house. That's where things seem to go wrong.
Oh, is that right?
Marilla allowed her face to give way to a caring smile. Yes, I've heard and repeated it 1,000 times.
Anne sighed.
I was the homeliest baby anybody had ever seen. I was so scrawny and tiny and nothing but eyes, but Mother thought I was perfectly beautiful. She was the only person in the world who thought I was perfectly beautiful, and she was dead of a fever before I was 3 months old. Marilla wondered if there was a time when her mother had considered her beautiful. From as far back as she could remember, family used words like homely, uncomely, and of course, ugly to describe her.
Oh, I'm sure that isn't true,
Marilla said with a warm smile, softening her expression just enough to let what beauty she did have show, if only for a moment. Oh, she's quite dead,
Anne said with a puzzled look back at Marilla. My yes, I just meant that others will find you beautiful, child. Your looks are as fine as any.
Marilla corrected their understanding. Yes, perhaps. Mr. and Mrs. Thomas, who raised me by hand, whatever that means, cared greatly for me. Yet I'm sure neither of them were too concerned with my looks, as they were both blind as church mice. Mrs. Thomas always used to scold me whenever I was naughty with the reproach of, "I raised you by hand," as if that had some virtue over other types of rearing. I think it's because she could hardly see in her old age and had to feel her way about.
It is better than to be raised by wolves, Miss Shirley.
Perhaps, but only by a whisker. You see, poor old Mr. Thomas fell under a train one afternoon and was killed. Probably on account of his poor vision.
Anne furrowed her brow as if she couldn't see. Ironically, her eyes continued to feast on the wondrous countryside that flew past the buggy.
From there, I had to go live at the sawmill with the Hammonds.
Anne stated as if she'd been summoned before the highest court in the land. She pulled 2 folded pieces of paper out of the front pocket of her wincey dress.
I've written a little one-act play about the experience. Would you like to read it with me?
That sounds fine to me. Just don't breathe a word of this to Sullivan Entertainment. A young, pigtailed Anne Shirley wanders wistfully through a woods of flimsy, replanted birch trees, clutching a copy of Tennyson's The Lady of Shalott.
No time hath she to sport and play, a charmed web she weaves alway. A curse is on her if she stay, her weaving either night or day, to look down to Camelot.
Anne was stealing her time away in the woods while the Hammond children chattered and screamed, and saw blades shrieked in the distant background, reminding Anne that her fantasy wasn't as perfectly casted and staged as she would like. Despite the drawbacks in the scenery department, Anne steeled herself for the role of a lifetime and continued.
She knows not what the curse may be, therefore she weaveth steadily, therefore no other care hath she, the Lady of Shalott.
Anne had been charged with the care of 3 sets of twins and several other children. At many times she lost count, so Anne had stolen herself away for a few moments to recite one of her favorite works. The chore of tending to the children didn't necessarily bother Anne, but twins 3 times in succession was far too encroaching upon a person's imagination. As often as she could, Anne would slip away into her own grand performances, the only audience a forest full of trees and critters.
She lives with little joy or fear, over the water running near. The sheep bell tinkles in her ear. Before her hangs a mirror clear, reflecting toward Camelot.
Anne did live in fear. Fear of an intoxicated Mr. Hammond who loved nothing more than to drown a bottle of whiskey, sire a new set of twins, and then smash every window in the house in a rage about how the place was being kept. Mrs. Hammond was equally terrifying, with as each successive impregnation, beating and smashing routine became more and more pitiless and depressed. Keen on taking out her sorrows by lashing out at the red-haired orphan she kept as a borderline slave. Why, Anne Shirley, this writing is absolutely scandalous.
Marilla balked. Her eyes bulged as she read forward in the well-worn pages filled with neatly written text. Oh, Marilla, may we continue? This has been the most chilling read I've ever done.
Anne begged with eyes that tore at a person's countenance, as if their second use, after seeing, was to change the minds of whomever stared into them. If I ever find that you've been writing tall tales about the happenings of Green Gables, I'll tan your backside.
Marilla's eyes focused deep and hard on the next lines of the read.
And as the mazy web she whirls, she sees the surly village churls, and the red cloaks of market girls pass onward from Shalott.
Anne found a way from time to time to escape the abuse and drudgery, and kept her spirits from dampening by forever looking for the beauty in the most unexpected places. It was late one night, after a binge and beating, that Anne discovered her window friend, Katie Morris, in the last unbroken window in the Hammond's parlor display. She found that Katie was a true kindred spirit, and her favorite poem was also The Lady of Shalott.
Sometimes a troop of damsels glad, an abbot of an ambling pad, sometimes a curly shepherd lad, or long-haired page in crimson clad, goes by toward Camelot.
As Anne was enraptured by the blissful writings of Camelot, she heard a terrible scream come from the Hammond front door. Bellowed Mrs. Hammond, carrying 2 children under her bulging arms.
Coming, Mrs. Hammond!
Anne screamed as she bolted from a place and tore down the muddy hillside towards the Hammond home.
Anne, get your firebranded little head in here and turn to Ben and Peter!
Mrs. Hammond called as she threw the children at Anne when she got as close as 3 or 4 paces. Anne caught the 2 children, and one of them oozed a thick brown liquid onto her hands and dress.
Yes, Mrs. Hammond.
Anne brought the children into the kitchen, where there was a table surrounded by the most rambunctious children you could imagine. Anne quickly removed the soiled garments from the child and splashed the baby clean in the basin of water next to the giant wood-burning stove that warmed a variety of pots and frying pans all day, every day. Anne tended the child as quickly and thoroughly as could be expected, yet Mrs. Hammond saw fit to yell at her anyways and began a lecture about the day's work.
Mr. Hammond has been waiting for well over an hour now for his lunch. And if I catch you dawdling one more time when you're supposed to be tending my young'uns, I swear to the Lord, I am going to take you down by the brook, and I'm going to call every neighbor we have.
And sometimes through the mirror blue, the knights come riding 2 and 2. She hath no loyal knight and true, the Lady of Shalott.
Anne had returned to Camelot as she stood in the Hammond's kitchen, slack-jawed and listening to the treatise on her own ineptitude coming from the frothing mouth of Mrs. Hammond. As she stood there, not paying any attention to what was happening, the poetry book poked out from Anne's knapsack, and Mrs. Hammond seized it greedily.
If I ever catch you reading any more of these fool books of yours while you're supposed to be tending my brood, well, I'll throw you in the fire along with this book.
As Anne watched the book burn in the giant cast-iron stove, fed by the sawdust and debris of the Hammond sawmill, she shed a bitter tear and recited,
But in her web she still delights to weave the mirror's magic sights, for often through the silent nights a funeral with plumes and lights and music come from Camelot.
Anne had been ejected from the Hammond home and was carrying an extremely heavy lunch pail back uphill towards the sawmill. The walk home was always something Anne had looked forward to, but the trudge up the muddy slope and then the 3/4-mile hike up a hillside path to the mill was an awful burden to her. The thin metal handle on the 20-pound lunch pail dug deeply into Anne's skinny hand as she dragged herself and the woodsman's lunch up the hill. She alternated the arm on which she was carrying the pail, as with anything more than a few seconds it began to burn her hands, and recited the rest from memory.
Or when the moon was overhead, came 2 young lovers, lately wed. I am half sick of shadows, said the Lady of Shalott.
Anne finished her poem right as she finished the walk to the mill. She took the final steps over the last hill and peered down to see the men working the saws and planks. To her surprise, she saw Mr. Hammond on a vicious tirade, screaming at 2 of his workers who were loading a cart with a team of horses attached. As he tore the load of lumber, throwing planks to the ground, he clutched his chest and fell to the dusty ground himself. With one final gasp of life, he cursed at his worker, who came over him to tend to his need. Anne watched as Mr. Hammond died, surrounded by the mill workers who stood around for about a half hour before deciding to shut the mill down for the day.
That's as far as I have written,
Anne explained as Marilla checked the back of the final folded page, only to see a few crude drawings of a man screaming and pointing his finger at a drawing of a houseplant.
I drew the houseplant first. I know it doesn't make any sense.
That was the least of my worry about this story,
Marilla responded as if she'd been thrown from a horse. I drew it on the back of that page before I knew how wonderful that story turned out to be.
Anne smiled as she folded up her script and shoved it back in the pocket of her ugly wincey dress. Indeed.
Well, Kappo Hammond says I mustn't embellish. So instead, I'm just going to say good night and thank you for listening to Kappo and The Rev's presentation of Chapter 5 of Anne of Green Gables, Anne's History.